Well, this is Dr. Stan back here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story, hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at, that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality and not illusion or delusion that will determine what the future will bring. And I have to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views. And since it's on Thursday, the views of Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. Hi, Joel. How are we doing?
I'm just fine, Dr. Stan. Good to hear from you.
Well, it's good to hear from you, and I want you to tell us what your take is on what's going on, certainly the situation going on over in Europe. Talk about, contradictions, crisis after crisis. Certainly, first of all, we're going to have a vote for the Greek people so they can decide whether to take the deal, and now we're not going to have a vote for the Greek people, and of course they couldn't really have a vote for the Greek people because they were going to go against this deal, and of course this deal is not going to solve the problem. It's just going to put off the day of reckoning, but apparently they want to put it off, at least temporarily. But the old adage is you can't spend money you don't have, and just as the United States is living on borrowed money, 43 cents of every dollar we spend or give away or destroy for no useful purpose. We've destroyed $1 trillion over in Afghanistan fighting about 50 members of Al-Qaeda. We've wasted $1 trillion over there, and we're giving money to other countries all throughout the world supporting dictators. So Greece has not been supporting dictators. They've just been living beyond their means. But the day of reckoning comes for Greece, for Portugal, for Spain, for Italy, perhaps for France, and eventually will come for America. I want your take on what's going on, or anything else you want to talk about.
Well, let's start with the Greek referendum. The sudden announcement from Greek Prime Minister Papandreou that he was calling a national referendum on the proposed EU debt restructuring deal sent the markets into a tailspin. At first, it was hard to tell what was going on inside the Greek cabinet. There were rumors of the referendum being called off and then on and then off. Mike Shedlock of Global Economic Analysis said, "One thing we know is Papandreou's call for a vote of confidence is on, and now it's off, so we really don't know. What we know is that his fragile coalition holds an extremely slim 3-margin majority in the parliament. If the referendum is on, the EU is no longer in control of a Greek debt default. More specifically, the EU was never in control, he says. It only appeared that way. Meanwhile, Merkel and Sarkozy are meeting in Cannes on November 3rd to discuss the Greek crisis in yet another EU G20 meeting summit. Now, here's why this issue is causing so much consternation in the markets. Papandreou was always considered a reliable Greek globalist who would always play along with the EU establishment. So this referendum thing does seem counterintuitive given his background. For the past 2 years, he had been assenting to everything demanded of him by the EU, including all of the austerity measures that proved so unpopular with people spoiled by socialist pension funds and socialist jobs and unionism. None of that kowtowing to the EU central bank has done anything for his political popularity, however, and the left wing that backs him. Remember that Papandreou's father was a closet communist who the left adored. As Shedlock implied, Papandreou is walking a tightrope. Any further concessions to the EU and his coalition collapses. So if he pulls a rabbit out of the hat to save himself, then he will hope to at least survive his coalition.
Well, but the question is that he couldn't allow the vote because it was very obvious the Greek people weren't going to go along with that. But no matter what happens, there's going to be serious economic consequences, not only for the Greece and the Greek people, but for the banks who bought the bonds and for the people who wrote the derivatives. The whole world financial system looks to me like it's sitting on the edge of apocalypse. We'll be right back. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Chris, I guess this afternoon, Thursday afternoon, Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief, we're talking about the Greek situation. First of all, why Papandreou was going to allow a vote of the people to determine whether they wanted to accept the terms that were offered, and we were told that he withdrew the offer. They're not going to have a vote. We don't know what's going on, but we do know certainly that the world certainly is facing a serious calamity. Greece is on the front lines of this, but of course there are many other countries involved, certainly that have been spending far more money than they have. You can't live on debt, and you can't certainly get out of a debt problem by taking on more debt, whether you're Greece or whether you're Washington, D.C. Go right ahead.
Well, as you said, the EU leadership and the financial markets are dead set against a referendum because of the probabilities that angry Greeks will vote this down and move to leave the EU. Well, it was just announced today, a few hours ago, that Papandreou had called off the referendum. The Globalist had more pull on him than his own party. And I want to be clear, the reason he was pushing for a referendum is that his party was going to go down into defeat over these austerity measures. And so essentially they wanted to cast the blame on the EU, and the only way they could do that as globalists is to say, well, let the people decide. Nobody can complain against democracy. They knew that the people would decide against that, the EU debt package, because of the austerity requirements that it required. And then they could say, well, the people have spoken. We're free and clear. But I think there was some arm twisting that went on to get him to change his mind. And certainly this puts the debt deal back on track. It kicks the can further down the road. Many analysts think that leaving the EU currency union would be a good thing for Greece. That way they could go back to the drachma and avoid all those tight money constraints. As I say, the EU is restricted. No country, and each country in the EU monetary unit prints their own euros. But to control it, they're required to stay within 3.5% inflation. Well, nobody stays within 3.5% anymore. Everyone's in an inflationary spiral, including Europe, which has had tremendous price increases in the past decade. But if they go back to the drachma, they get to avoid those tight money constraints. They can print all the money they want, but that certainly won't solve the things for long. It will cause more inflation and increase Greek tourism again, which is, you see, Greece doesn't have a lot of exports, which if you inflate your currency, that makes your exports more cheaper for other people to buy. But it doesn't have much to export. Well, Greece got into this mess, of course, because of the socialism and lots of free money. The EU has
hold that thought, and Greek is Joel is just pointing out that Greece got into its problem because it's a socialist country. And because the socialists keep giving the people more and more money, with the old idea that, of course, if you can take from Peter to give to Paul, you can always depend upon Paul's vote. Or even better still, if you can give to both Peter and Paul, you can get votes from all of them. And it's wonderful. You just keep giving away money and benefits and pensions but then, of course, where does the money come from down the road? And this is where they are today. They do not have the funds to finance all the wonderful welfare programs that they've set out there. And what's going to happen is they're going to have marked austerity. They're going to have to cut back on the pensions, the age of retirement, all these socialist benefits. An awful lot of people are going to lose their jobs. They're going to destroy the value of their currency. And basically, the Greek people are up in arms. They don't want to give up all the things they've been promised, and yet the reality is you can't spend money you don't have. You can't get out of debt by amassing more debt. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, the EU leaders don't want Greece to leave the European Union because they're desperately trying to hold the EU together, a major and important step in the New World Order. There's a major rebellion going on in the UK against entrance into the EU, and all this mess has proven that the EU skeptics in Britain are quite right. That's why Prime Minister Cameron in Britain has no intention of letting his voters have a referendum. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Papandreou is saying the voters will approve the EU debt reduction deal, but few in the markets believed him. I still think the EU leaders will pull a rabbit out of the hat, and I wrote that this morning before they had turned Papandreou around, and certainly they did. If they hadn't turned this around, there would certainly have been domino effects. If Greece pulled out, then Italy would be a problem, the next problem that they would have to concentrate on, much, much bigger, about 5 times the size of the Greece problem, then Portugal, then Ireland, and other sinking countries. ZeroHedge.com seems to concur. They said while the focus continues to be on Papandreou for the second day in a row following his shocking referendum announcement, the real division or diversion remains Italy, where the government is in as much a state of chaos as that in Athens, and whose bonds, while not yet trading at Greek levels, are descending rapidly. The only thing preventing the collapse of Italian bonds so far has been the European Central Bank, whose monetizing assistance has been contingent on Italy passing and enforcing austerity measures similar to the deal with Greece. There's runaway debt in Italy of 120% of GDP. Unfortunately, when the powers that be begin to bail out one country, everyone else stops being responsible and waits for their bailout in turn. Silvio Berlusconi on Wednesday failed to issue growth-boosting measures demanded by the European Union authorities ahead of the Group of 20 summit, raising further doubts about the government's willingness to pass economic reforms amid a restoring investor confidence. Zero Hedge, which is written under the pseudonym of Tyler Durden, and many other financial advisors don't seem to understand that the underlying globalist agenda in Europe is the thing that's driving this, not necessarily debt solvency. Otherwise, they wouldn't be making statements like this. Here's Zero Hedge. Now that the ejection of Greece is virtually certain from the EU, perhaps it would be a prudent idea for what little remains of the healthy European core to kick out all of the stragglers before everything becomes infected and before French bonds trade at yields indicative of sub-Greek bond levels. Mr. Berlusconi's cabinet late Wednesday approved a plan to sell state property, slash red tape, and roll out infrastructure projects, according to people familiar with the matter, in a bid to appease the G20. But they failed to rein in high union contracts and other things that the markets are insisting that they do. So, in a consequence of this, the meeting at the G20 that's going on right now seems to be frantic. This past month, the G20 could not be induced to address adding additional funds to the EU bailout pool. None of the smaller countries are in good enough straits they don't have anything extra to add to that pool. And I suspect that there'll be a lot of arm twisting going on behind the scenes in Cannes this weekend. Well, the main story, Dr. Stan, of tomorrow's World Affairs Brief is going to be the issue of Israel building for war with Iran. There's been a steady crescendo of war drums beating in an effort to beef up public support for an attack on Iran. Several months ago, the U.S. and Israeli intelligence agents blasted Iran's centrifuges with the Stuxnet virus, specifically designed to corrupt Siemens industrial computer processes used by the Iranians in their nuclear projects. Iranian scientists have even been murdered by Israeli agents. These are acts of war, and last month the U.S. falsified an attempted assassination of the Saudi ambassador to the U.S. Then a House committee in Congress voted for more sanctions on Iran, despite the disaster effects these sanctions are having on civilians, just like in Iraq. There's a lack of spare parts and equipment for hospitals, and even airplanes there. There have been hundreds of airplane deaths in the past 2 years in Iran because they're flying these airplanes without sufficient maintenance due to lack of spare parts. This month, Israel successfully tested a medium-range ballistic missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, and this was to telegraph a message to Iran, of course, that if you retaliate after our strike, we'll have nuclear weapons aimed at you. China responded with a continuation of Chinese missile technology transfers to Iran, and the stage, in my opinion, is being set for a major war in the Middle East.
Well, it's going to be very interesting. You may very well be right. I'm just going to
Well, Bill Gertz of the Washington Times reports that, China's continuing to provide advanced missiles and other conventional arms to Iran, and is doing so in violation of UN sanctions against the Tehran regime. Strategically, both Russia and China, and I might say that Russia continues to provide not only nuclear power and nuclear weapons technology to Iran, but also a full array of anti-aircraft missiles batteries. Strategically, both Russia and China are interested in allowing the U.S. to continue to build its reputation as the bully of the world, which will eventually be used to justify a Russian-Chinese attack on the U.S. The meaning of that statement is there's got to be a reason why the Russians and the Chinese will not, in fact, stand up against a U.S. attack on Iran or an Israeli. They could. They could threaten military intervention, and it would stop Israel if they realized they were going to meet Russian or Chinese jets at the border. But as I say, both Russia and China are interested in allowing the U.S. to continue to become the bully of the world, and they allow that by allowing them to continue to romp through the rest of the world, Libya, Egypt, Syria, and now Iran, and it's going to accrue more hatred against the United States. The Russians in particular still have things to gain by allowing the U.S. To attack other smaller countries that can't defend themselves. They position their electronic sensors throughout U.S. war zones in order to eavesdrop on U.S. military communications and tactics. In the Iraq War, for example, it was documented that Russians successfully tested a new anti-tank projectile that acts like a boring rod, successfully knocked out at least one Abrams tank despite the latest in ceramic armor. So this is a problem that apparently with the globalist agenda, both Israel and the U.S. are willing to disregard or at least encourage. I happen to think that the United States wants Russia and China to have an excuse to attack someday, since this global war that they've been preparing for themselves with underground bunkers is meant to drive Americans into accepting a militarized New World Order as the means of saving ourselves from this next big World War III. Well, Israel has long been planning a preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear program, and the U.S. has been planting disinformation to make it appear as if it opposes the strike. The U.S. government leaked various versions of why Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta was going to Israel, telling journalists that he was there to demand that Israel stop planning an attack on Iran. This is utter hogwash. According to one source I quoted in the WAB last year, the U.S. and European globalists during a European and U.S. globalist meeting in a city of London, they've been pushing Israel to attack Iran since 2004, and we're quite upset that Israel still hasn't accomplished that assignment. Now that tells the world about the fact that despite who's in office in Israel, whether left or right, especially Netanyahu, they are globalists and they follow globalist orders. Israel, however, lacked sufficient public justification during the early part of the decade for such an aggression, and therefore has backed off from their planning many times. The U.S. and its allies have been helping to build the case against Iran by exaggerating Iran's nuclear threat, with the exception of the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate, which completely reversed itself and claimed Iran gave up its nuclear weapons program. Now, this was done to give the Bush administration an excuse to stand down its armada of 3 aircraft carrier task forces that were currently in the Gulf awaiting orders to strike Iran in late 2007 or early 2008. Such a strike without a Gulf of Tonkin justification. Gulf of Tonkin, if your listeners will remember, is that faked attack that the U.S. government did, claiming that North Korean gunboats attacked their ships in the Gulf of Tonkin and used to bring before Congress to get a declaration of war to start the Vietnam conflict.
And, of course, it didn't take place. Even McNamara eventually admitted after 58,000 American boys were killed and about 3 million Vietnamese. He shucks, it never occurred. I just don't know how that happened. Ladies and gentlemen, they sent our boys to fight and bleed and suffer and die with trumped-up charges, and I fear it's going to happen again quite soon. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, it's interesting that U.S. black operations did try to goad Iranian speedboats into attacking some of the U.S. naval forces that had slipped into the Gulf of Hormuz. They would have created the black operations got on the radio with the Iranian-speaking people and tried to make it appear to the American ships as if the speedboats were preparing to attack. They were trying to get the American commander to blast those gunboats out of the water, which would have caused an Iranian retaliation. But the American skipper didn't take the bait, and he failed to respond, which was a good thing. It avoided war. Well, all of this, if there were a war to start in 2008, this would have accrued to the benefit of an anti-war Republican candidate, Ron Paul. He was the only Republican opposing more wars of intervention, which the powers that be could not risk having him get a leg up over the other ones with an unpopular war starting over Iran. But after Paul was sidelined through manipulation of the Republican nominating procedure, that's the one that gave us John McCain as a disaster. The U.S. once again reversed the national intelligence estimate, and Iran suddenly became a threat again. So go figure. It appears that they changed that intelligence estimate for political purposes. Now, as I proposed last week, I think the strike on Iran will be the excuse that allows the current administration to cancel its final withdrawal from Iraq, which the powers that be have no intention of doing on a permanent basis. That may well be why the big propaganda push against Iran is going on right now, and may explain why Israel and the U.S. would sacrifice preemption military secrecy in favor of building popular support. In other words, they can run a preemptive strike any time to surprise Iran, but now with so much drum beating going on about this war, it's very clear that Iran knows it's coming and is fully prepared. But they're willing to sacrifice that secrecy about when to strike for the fact that the greater danger for the globalist is starting another war, that would be very unpopular with Americans. With the current state of the economy, Stan, the American public's not in favor of another $1 trillion war in the Middle East. Unless, of course, the administration can make it look like we were attacked innocently. Now, they failed to get Iran to do such an attack on the West, but they'll still trying to conjure up an excuse to make it look like it's not our fault. Part of that will be, I think, using Israel to run a preemptive strike, then having the Iranians retaliate against U.S. forces in Iraq that are still there, and giving us an excuse then to go to war. Well, any cursory glance will show that international newspapers are awash in stories about the building consensus for an attack by Israel on Iran. There was a report in the Israeli journal Yediot Aharonot that said Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Ehud Barak favor an attack. Well, there's no surprise there. Another center-left newspaper in Israel, Haaretz, said that most of Netanyahu's cabinet is now in favor of such an attack, despite the guaranteed retaliation that is expected. Well, Israel's missile test was a not-so-subtle warning that Israel is planning a much bigger retaliation, perhaps a nuclear retaliation, and more than Iran can dish out. Now, it's very important to understand that there will be a barrage of missiles flying into Israel when they start this attack on Iran or shortly thereafter.
Hold that thought. We'll be back in just a moment. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and certainly Joel is saying that he believes that there is going to be an Israel missile attack on Iran. Iran, of course, will then retaliate not only against Israel, but probably against the United States. Now, Joel didn't say that, but certainly I did, but I think that's what's going to happen. But Joel is making the point that if Israel attacks Iran, Iran will counter with an attack, a missile attack on Israel. Pick that story up, and then I want your thought about whether Iran will retaliate against the United States as well as Israel if there's an attack. Go ahead.
Well, yes, they will retaliate against the U.S. because they know that the U.S. has given the green light, and the U.S. is really the power behind Israel. So there will be and the globalists want that retaliation against our troops. They want to bloody the waters so that they can give us an excuse to join the war. you see, then it looks like to the American people that our leaders didn't start that. Israel started that. And they're more willing to forgive Israel because of all of the Christian sentiment about the return of the Jews to their homeland. And that's being used by the politicians against Christians to foment false patriotism towards Israel, which frankly isn't worthy, as speaking of the government, of our support. I think the people are. You are not all, guilty of what their government is doing. But as I think this strike on Iran will in fact justify the powers that be in America saying that we're not going to continue on with this withdrawal in Iraq. It was very obvious that these huge air bases in Iraq are meant to stage a strike against Iran. Any cursory glance will show of the map that, in fact, that there's a big squeeze play that's been going on. Iran is sandwiched in between Afghanistan on the east and Iraq on the west. And so we have military forces on either side of Iran. It's going to be very difficult for her to survive what the U.S. has in store there. Even Britain has admitted to openly planning to support strikes on Iran. Laura Rosen wrote for the Associated Press saying that Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Ehud Barak are working to convince other members of Netanyahu's cabinet and Israeli security chiefs that Israel needs to launch a preemptive strike despite the threat of incoming missile retaliation. Well, on the one hand, she writes, there's a mounting rumor of an Israeli move that will change the face of the Middle East. And the reason it will change the face of the Middle East is there are thousands of missiles, large and small, aimed at Israel from Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. If they were unleashed in barrages as expected, the Israeli Arrow ABM system will be overwhelmed and not able to stop it. The Israeli defense minister has even said, we only intend to use the Arrow system to protect military bases, not civilians. And they also worry that it will seal Israel's fate for generations to come. On the other hand, there's a total absence of any public debate. Now, this is very typical of globalist politicians. They have a hidden agenda, and they aren't about to ask for permission from the people to pursue it. And that's why they aren't debating in the public, or there's no really loyal opposition in the parliament that even dares bring up a defense of not attacking Iran. The issue of whether to attack Iran is the bottom of the Israeli discourse, and it ought to be the top because it's at the top of the agenda of the Israeli globalist leaders. From Israel's perspective, it may feel like it has little to lose from carrying out strikes on Iran in terms of its regional standing. The reason is Israel sees its strategic position amid the Arab awakening as deteriorating. There's no peace process, and that's purposeful, as Netanyahu has deliberately poisoned the waters of talks by pushing settlement boundaries into Arab lands and encouraging terror by releasing over 1,000 prisoners for one hostages last month. It didn't help things when Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas said he would never recognize a Jewish state and that capturing Ghalid Shalit was a good thing. That's the one they paid that terrible hostage price for, which goes against the principles that state that you never pay terrorism for a hostage lest you induce them to capture more. Well, the media reports also came as the UN watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Commission, is due to issue a report on Iran's nuclear program on November 8th. And it's certainly going to raise tensions in the regions by stating that Iran's nuclear program is even more threatening than it was last year.
Well, I think we're all being manipulated. I think that the American people are being constantly manipulated. It's so reminiscent of the way things were back in 1941 when we were being told over and over again about the threat of Japan, and it was only a matter of time before we were at war with Iran. Well, with Japan, we were at war with Iran. We had put all sorts of restrictions on Japan. We had certainly prevented them from buying oil anywhere in the world, from getting imports. When you put those sort of restrictions on another nation, that's an act of war. We had already declared war on Japan. The American people just didn't know.
While the storm clouds gather far across the sea,
ahead, Joel.
Okay. Well, as I say, Britain's armed forces are stepping up their contingency planning for potential military action against Iran. So we know when they start making military preparations and U.S. forces are preparing in earnest for such an attack. We're going to see new naval groups steaming for that area. A lot of air forces have been put on alert. And the UK defense minister believes that the U.S. may decide to fast forward plans for targeting missile strikes at some key Iranian facilities. British officials say that if Washington presses ahead with the attacks on Iran, it will seek and receive UK military help for its mission despite some deep reservations within the coalition government. Well, that's an understatement. There's huge reservations within the British government, but they will be overridden by the conservative government and it seems like whenever we go to war, we have a Republican or a conservative government in office because they can more induce their conservative constituents to go along with war. And as the Daily Mail reported, Israel considers Iran its most dangerous threat, and it keeps pumping that idea out to their people at all times to get them prepared for this. It cites Tehran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile development program, repeated references by the Iranian leader to Israel's destruction, and its support for anti-Israel militant groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Iran denies these allegations that it aims to produce a bomb, saying its nuclear program is meant only to produce energy. I personally think that Iran is trying to produce a nuclear weapon, but that may be quite natural given the globalist powers in the West have long been setting Iran up for destruction and or control. In fact, U.S. intelligence is the one that started them down the nuclear path. This is the dialectic strategy, create new enemies to generate reasons for future intervention. By funneling nuclear weapons plans, even though they were flawed, to the Iranians through the Cain nuclear network operating out of Pakistan, and that Cain network was an extension of the CIA. Well, strategically, this may be one of the reasons why the U.S. government was planning to invade and occupy both Afghanistan and Iraq before the 9/11 attack, which that attack conveniently provided the never-ending excuse for the phony war on terror. As my longtime subscribers know, I and others have documented the abundant evidence that the 9/11 attack could only have been designed and carried out by black operations elements within our own government using controlled demolition of the 3 World Trade Center buildings in concert with terrorist patsies that the CIA controlled and nurtured and taught to fly airplanes.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Chris Joel is simply pointing out that we've been funneling through Pakistan false plans for nuclear weapons to Iran. The Cain network, Dr. Cain was the Pakistani who developed the Pakistani bomb. What people don't understand is he was working for the CIA all the time, and this whole thing, the CIA provided the bomb for Pakistan, and Pakistan's been providing, of course, plans for Iran so they can have a nuclear weapon. But, of course, they're not going to be an explosive nuclear weapon, sort of like, as far as I'm concerned, the young man, he was Arab, he went over there to Pakistan to learn how to build a bomb. He was going to set it off in Times Square, and he learned how to build a bomb. And he came back to New York, and he built a bomb, and he took his car, and he parked it right there in Times Square. But he didn't know it was a smoke bomb. It was built not to go off, and that's, basically this is how you do it. Everybody thinks, oh, terrible threat, they came over to build a bomb and he just made a mistake. No, I'm sure that they know how to build a bomb over in Pakistan. They just gave him the wrong plan. So we feel threatened, and oh my goodness, the Muslims are a terrible threat to us, because I fear that this coming war with Iran may very well expand into other countries. It's only a matter of time, I think, before we're at war, perhaps with other countries over there. What are your thoughts on that, Joel?
Well, I think that's true. Even if the U.S. temporarily pulls out of Iraq, massive U.S. bases will remain under a skeleton crew so that they can be deactivated or reactivated within days of starting a war within Iran. Now, here's my best guess on how this is going to play out. The UN report on Iran's nuclear program will declare that the Iranian program is reaching a dangerous stage. The U.S. will then ask the UN for deeper sanctions to include gasoline. The hope is to induce Iran to strike out, just as Japan did when British cut off the Japanese from access to British petroleum in the colonies. Iran won't lash out, but will begin making defensive military preparations, and Israel will distort this claim to make the case that those are offensive preparations, and that will justify their long-planned airstrikes going around into Saudi Arabia. I think it's very important that people understand the geography here, that to the north and the east, Israel is surrounded by Lebanon to the north, and then there's Syria, and Turkey's even further to the north there, and all of those are hostile to Israel right now. So they can't overfly those areas on their attack. They can't even go straight west or straight east over Jordan. So they'll try to thread the needle down at the Gaza Strip between the border of Jordan and Egypt. And that's why they needed permission from Saudi Arabia to overfly their territory. They can also, it's a long way over there, they'll need aerial refueling, and they'll also probably have to have the option of being able to land in U.S. air bases in Iraq, and that may provide the needed justification for Iraq to retaliate against U.S. air bases, killing Americans as well.
You mean Iran to retaliate against?
I'm sorry.
Right.
Iran to retaliate against.
I know it's so easy to get mixed up on that, but Iran to retaliate against Iraq and against our forces then, because, of course, the reason if Israel is allowed to land in Iraq to refuel at our bases, this becomes an act of a war against Iran on our part. But go right ahead.
Well, I think as soon as all of this unleashes and America gets into the war, that Iran will unleash its allies in Syria and Lebanon and Egypt, and we're going to see missile barrages land on Israel. This will be the first time. It's going to be a very damaging time for Israel. I think there'll be multiple strikes that hit home within civilian areas. To a large extent, it will induce a combination of outrage against Israel for starting the war and sympathy for Israel with all the civilian casualties that they will take in this process. But all in all, I think the West will beat the drums of war and justification, and the U.S. will continue to actually annihilate the infrastructure, military and civilian, of Iran. I think the strategy is, since we don't have the troops or the patience of Americans to occupy Iran, that they will have to simply bomb it into a state of non-operation so that Iranians cease to become a threat and become compliant. I think there will also be CIA inducing operatives within the Iranian opposition to take over the government. And we'll have another puppet government just like we've got in Libya and just like we've got in Egypt right now.
But I think it's so vitally important the American people remember. It was the American CIA that brought the Ayatollahs to power back in 1979. We overthrew the Shah. We certainly brought Ayatollah Khomeini to power. In fact, an article on certainly the Alex Jones site today, and you can find it there. Quoting at the time, recently, somebody had written, one of the Arabs had written, he found it so difficult to believe that the CIA would have brought the Ayatollahs to power. But now he was firmly convinced, we brought the Ayatollahs to power. We brought this radical regime to power. Why would they have done that in 1979? Why long-term planning, ladies and gentlemen, is now over 30 years later, and we're planning for a war with this very regime we installed. Go right ahead.
Well, I think when the secret acts of men are revealed someday, and at the second coming, when we learn about all the evil that has been done on earth, we will be shocked, even those of us that believe in conspiracy, at how much was planned and how far ahead, and I think how deeply Satan was involved in inspiring people to take away liberty and destroy the great things that God provided for us here on earth.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that Ahmadinejad looks to me like, of course, he's playing a part. I think that Arafat with his red bandana, his kerchief on his head played a part. I think Fidel Castro is playing a part. It's all political theater. And that's why, of course, David Rockefeller's daughters can go down to visit Fidel, and Fidel can come up to visit David Rockefeller. Why, I thought David Rockefeller was the enemy. Well, of course, if you think that, why, you probably believe everything they're telling you. It's all political theater. But go right ahead.
Well, even in the Libyan situation, you know, the new prime minister's been announced. He's supposed to be an erudite professor, and it's going to give a nice, kindly face to the horrible atrocities committed by the revolutionaries there who destroyed and killed Omar Gaddafi. I'm not defending Gaddafi as a wonderful person. I think he did quite a bit for his people, but he still was corrupt in his own way, as all leaders that have, you know, corruptible power are. But as all the nations reported as liberated in the succession of Arab Spring revolts, the U.S. and NATO have traded one controlled dictator for another controlled puppet president or prime minister. Associated Press recently reported that Libya's rebel militants have named a new prime minister this week. His name is Abdurrahim El-Kaib, as a progressive leftist academic who has spent decades in the United States teaching at Alabama University and leading the local Muslim community. Well, mentioned briefly is the fact that his former employer was the Petroleum Institute, based in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, and sponsored by BP, Shell, Francis Total, the Japan Oil Development Company, and the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. El-Kaib is listed as professor and chairman in his Petroleum Institute profile, which also describes extensive research conducted by him, sponsored by U.S. government agencies. He hasn't lived in Libya for years. In essence, El-Kaib, like his predecessor Jalil, is Libyan in name only and has been working for Western corporations, governments, institutions for decades. And like Jalil or Egypt's Mohammed al-Baradi, El-Kaib is yet another agent of Western interest masquerading as an indigenous leader in a foreign land. That his rise to power was paid by thousands of NATO strikes, sorties, in a 7-month military operation spearheaded by the U.S., and at the cost of tens of thousands, makes his ascension to power in Libya ever more a desecration of Libya's sovereignty. Meanwhile, the London Telegraph reports that NATO-backed rebels turned their weapons on each other yet again in Tripoli, with hundreds of fighters exchanging fire near a hospital after one armed faction tried to murder a patient that they had injured the night before. That's the kind of infighting we've yielded to in Libya. The report also cites a growing list of atrocities committed by rebel fighters before noting the unprecedented nature of NATO's victory in Libya. Well, while the mainstream media attempts to ignore or plead ignorance over the growing body of evidence suggesting that both NATO and the rebels committed the very atrocities they accuse Gaddafi of committing, as a pretext for the half-year-long murder spree, it's been well documented since fighting began in February that the rebels, far from being pro-democratic fighters, were actually al-Qaeda, affiliated Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, LIFG. These militants have a long history of terrorism and barbarism. It's also been extensively documented that these are the same rebels that killed U.S. and British troops in both Iraq and in Afghanistan, and some of them have even admitted to that in interviews. So sometimes the war on terror makes for strange bedfellows. Despite this, U.S. representatives, including our most famous warmongering Senator John McCain, who sabotaged, along with Senator John Kerry, the POW-MIA investigation in Congress, he personally met with LIFG militants, praising them as heroes who have, quote, inspired the world. Alarmingly, McCain made his remarks in Tripoli, even as rebels publicly declared their intention to purposely cut off supplies and medical aid to the town of Sirte, which Gaddafi was killed at, to admittedly starve the city into submission. But there was silence in NATO and the United States, even though this would have constituted a grievous war crime. Well, moving on to another topic, Herman Cain.
Before we do that, let's go ahead and tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you, and certainly if they'd like to subscribe to the World Affairs Brief, to get a copy of it, and then tell them a little bit about your books, because they are becoming increasingly apropos, very, very important for people to know about strategic relocation as we move into a period of chaos and crisis in America. How to have a secure home, a secure room in your home. Why don't you go ahead and tell them how to get your publication and, of course, your books.
Thanks, Stan. The World Affairs Brief is where to go for a review of my World Affairs Brief and lots of free material, previous articles and other things that I've written listed on the right-hand side. There is a modest subscription for the World Affairs Brief, and that's all on my website. People can get a free sample issue by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. And if they email me tomorrow, they'll get the kind of brief that we're talking about, which is very important to understand. My books are showcased on my website, joelskousen.com, and you can get there from worldaffairsbrief.com. You can see a listing of all the books that I've written, including Strategic Relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places. That's my best-selling book, and extremely important in this day and age when people need to be concerned about social unrest and the Occupy Wall Street movement and terrorist attacks and even war eventually. Even if one can't leave the cities, it's very important to prepare for contingency plans, and I cover all of those things, including international retreats, full-color maps in this third edition of all the states and provinces of the United States and Canada, and my recommendations on where the best places in every region is to go. And I don't just, cover the top-rated areas. I cover significant safe areas in almost everywhere in the country, even though certain states like Hawaii, Florida, and Alaska are not hardly safe under many circumstances.
And, of course, what about the books?
Yes. That's one book, Strategic Relocation. The other book, The Secure Home, 700 pages of everything you want to know about high-security construction and self-sufficiency, including generators and solar, water and wind power. The last book is How to Implement a High-Security Shelter in the Home, architectural plan book of how to do a safe room in a basement, and all of these three books are available from Radio Liberty.
By calling 1-800-544-8927, 1-800-544-8927. They're among our bestsellers. Go right ahead, Joe.
Well, last story I want to cover on our show today is Herman Cain confronting his own Anita Hill. That's a reference to, of course, the sad story of Clarence Thomas, who always insisted that Anita Hill was lying about her accusation about his sexual advances. Turns out that Anita Hill was true, and Clarence Thomas was lying. Now, Thomas, of course, a lot of conservatives feel justified in defending Thomas because he finally did get on the Supreme Court, and he's been such a conservative jurist. But, in fact, he's a controlled man because of those sexual problems that he had, that the government is and always will be holding over his head. And when it comes to crucial votes, like investigating Obama's false or alien past and being born outside the United States, he, along with all other conservatives on it, refused to hear the case. But Herman Cain, of course, has been accused of making sexual advances to women under his employ when head of the National Restaurant Association in the 1990s. He is protesting against these accusations, much like Clarence Thomas did. This is particularly damaging. Well, of course, Cain's protestations are particularly suspect because there are multiple victims now, and each one of them have been paid off by the Restaurant Association to keep them silent. This is particularly damaging to Cain, who's an ordained minister and regularly takes part in religious rallies and events, along with former governor and Republican presidential candidate Mike Huckabee. Cain was viewed as the mainstream answer to Mike Huckabee's unwillingness to challenge Mitt Romney this time around. As setting an example, as a Southern preacher and as someone representing the evangelical movement, this hypocrisy, has been especially damaging. I hope that Christians will not try to blindly defend him because he is an ordained minister and realize that men are flawed, they do make mistakes. Cain's biggest mistakes is not admitting it and moving on by trying to deny these things. He's causing a much bigger firestorm. As Politico wrote, we have learned that one of the women who accused Herman Cain of sexual harassment at the National Restaurant Association received a payout of $45,000. That's more than a year's salary. Another one received a payout of some $36,000. And, of course, Restaurant Association with a large legal staff does not, in fact, let themselves be shaken down by false accusations. So this is very, very damaging to Cain's reputation. And it's not about to get any easier. Previously, the New York Times reported the second woman that I mentioned with a payout of severance of $35,000. Cain had said the woman's complaint is one that he does recall, but he has described it as baseless and says she received a negligible termination settlement for perhaps 2 or 3 months' salary, and it turned out to be a whole year's salary.
Well, it's unfortunate, but unfortunately, as you say, men are flawed. But
well, national organizations like this, as I say, are very strong about, the shakedown if this is a baseless attempt. But there's 2 women, and now there's a 3rd one that's coming out. So I don't think Cain is going to survive this.
Well, maybe not. Certainly, I do not trust him. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a member of the establishment. They're running him. They're desperate to find somebody. You would think of the country this size, they could find somebody that would appeal to the public, but really none of them do. They're all created by the establishment that controls both political parties. Well, Joe, you've got 3 minutes to wrap up the program.
Well, we have watched this Republican charade going on for months now, Stan, and we've seen Republicans throw everything they can to try to derail the candidacy of Mitt Romney. And I'm not saying this because I'm a Romney fan, and I am not. I don't feel like he's going to be trustworthy in office. But it's very interesting to watch them manipulate the process. First it was Tim Pawlenty that was going to knock him off. Then it was Rick Santorum. And then when that didn't go in, of course, Michelle Bachmann was too conservative. They didn't want to try to promote her, and I don't think she's really, got the capability of running for president, but perhaps vice president. Certainly Rick Perry was brought up and given huge polling numbers, far in excess of reality. He flopped. Then they tried to get Chris Christie up, and of course I think he had skeletons in his closet, didn't want to come under the scrutiny as Cain is. Then they threw up Herman Cain. Huntsman has gone nowhere. I don't know who they got left. I think they're going to have to manipulate Romney because he's probably going to win the nomination. And they're doing that in spades by surrounding him with advisors like Michael Chertoff, the Darth Vader of the TSA, Michael Hayden, his assistant, and Chertoff and Associates. And there's one other assistant from Chertoff, and they've got a whole slew of neocon advisors advising him on going to war. I don't think we're going to see any difference in a Romney presidency than the Obama, other than not pursuing the Obamacare issue.
Well, you may be right. It's going to be fascinating to see. The one thing they fear more than anything else, of course, is Ron Paul, that he might just get to the American people. But the difficulty is they control the media, and, of course, his message is not getting out. We'll be back in just a moment. God bless. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you, Stan.
And, of course, this is Dr. Stan, and we do hope you enjoy our program every week with Joel Skousen. And certainly the big issue is, of course, Ron Paul is the only one of the candidates who is willing to speak out against the war. He's the only one who's willing to say, we're going to have to start cutting back on government. And he has named what he wants to do. We're going to do away with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Commerce. We're going to do away with the Department of the Interior. We're going to do away with the Department of Education, the Department of Energy, and we'll save $1 trillion the first year. And of course, he's very careful not to talk about Social Security and Medicare, and basically say we will try to keep these things going, but we can have a balanced budget within 3 years, and I think he probably could. But I don't think that they want to give him a chance, because they do not want anybody who is not under their complete and total control. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and we do hope, of course, that those of you who listen to the program certainly enjoy Joel. I always enjoy Joel. I think he's one of the most astute observers, and it's very disquieting to hear him talking about this war with Iran, and yet you can see how they're building up support. They control the media, and we get on the article day after day after day after day about the danger of Iran and about how they're working to build nuclear weapons. And ladies and gentlemen, everything suggests that they're planning on a war with Iran. And certainly, I think that Joel's presentation today was very, very important. Of course, basically, when you have a financial situation such as we have, where 43 cents out of every dollar you spend has to be borrowed, how do you get out of a mess like this? why you have a war, and then you can sit to get people back working, and you get the economy going, you destroy the value of the currency in the meantime, but everybody who's patriotic will support the government, even if it means, of course, that we are totally dependent upon government, our life savings are destroyed. This is where I think we're going, and certainly we're in for some very difficult times. You need to read my book, Brotherhood of Darkness. You need to hear the CDs from the latest seminar. We had the seminar last week, and those CDs are available. There are 5 of them. Each one is about an hour and a half long. Give us a call to 1-800-544-8927 and ask for the CDs of the seminar. I would mention Barry Shamish, who's a regular guest on our programs, and he's having some serious medical problems. Now, Barry is not a Christian. He's not a believer, and he did not ask me to put in a plea for people to help him. He believes he has to help himself, but he really doesn't have any means of raising the money that he needs for the medical procedure. So if you are in a position to help, and I told him I was going to certainly put out a plea. He did not ask me to. He did not endorse this. But if you're in a position to help Barry Shamish, go to his website, barryshamish.com. That's barryshamish.com. And at the bottom of his blog, there is a PayPal button, and if you're in a position to help, why, please do. And if you're not in a position to help, why, of course, pray for Barry for his provision and protection. He doesn't believe in prayer, but I told him I'm firmly convinced that it does work, and God does help people, and who knows what influence your support or your prayers could have. So if you're in a position to help Barry, I would consider it a favor to my ministry, just because Barry has always been a faithful guest on our program, has very interesting ideas when we have on a regular basis, because he has a completely different outlook on what's going on over in Israel, and he is willing to be very critical of the Israeli government when they're doing the wrong thing, and very, very few Jews will do that. But he is loyal to his religion. He believes with all of his heart that Israel is the true religion. Well, because I think Christians would maybe disagree with that, but that's neither here nor there. I think that the important thing is he does need help at this time. So if you're in a position to help, please do help. And you can do that by going to his PayPal button. You will find at his website, or certainly by praying for him and for his provision. And then, of course, I do need to mention, of course, if you have not, of course, heard my talk on the World Revolution, you'll actually hear my interview with the American ambassador to Cuba in 1959, as he tells you how the government knew Fidel Castro was a communist, and they brought him to power anyway. And then, of course, if you want to know about David Rockefeller's daughters going down to visit good old Fidel, why, of course, you can get David Rockefeller's book we carry. It's called Memoirs. David Rockefeller's Memoirs, and of course, how Fidel goes up to visit David. And David there readily admits on page 405 he's part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States. As he said, some people even characterized me and my family as working against the best interests of the United States with others to bring about a more integrated global economic and political structure. And if that's the charge, I am guilty.